Coming up today on Uncommon Sense, we interview Holly Ordway, the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute and author of a new book on Tolkien. Stay tuned to learn more. Hello, and welcome to Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. I'm Grettelyn Darkey, your host, and I'm joined as always by my wonderful co-host, Joe. Joe, how are you today?
Very well, thank you.
Great. And we're so blessed to be here with Holly Ordway, who, as I said, is the Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute. And she is also a visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. And this is actually her second book on Tolkien, which came out at the beginning of September. Is that right, Holly?
Yes.
Wonderful. And it actually, her first book on Tolkien, which you can also get, got a Mythopoeic Society award. So we're here with a real Tolkien expert today, and very excited because the newest book that she's put out is called Tolkien's Faith, a spiritual biography, which is kind of a groundbreaking work. No one's really done this before for Tolkien. So we're very excited about that. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, though, first, Holly? We'd like to know a little bit about you, and then we can dive into your work more.
Oh, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here and talking about Chesterton and Tolkien, and both those authors whom I obviously love Tolkien, but also have a great fondness for Chesterton. So I'm primarily a Tolkien scholar, so I write about Tolkien, but also the Inklings more broadly speaking, C.S. Lewis, and I work in apologetics, particularly literary and imaginative apologetics. So again, really intersecting with authors like Chesterton, Tolkien, Lewis, MacDonald, those kinds of authors.
Wonderful. So you could, if you don't mind, just telling us a little bit about your first Tolkien book, and then we can dive into the second one.
Right. So my earlier Tolkien book is called Tolkien's Modern Reading: Middle Earth Beyond the Middle Ages. Came out in 2021, so just 2 years ago. It's been quite the busy season for me, and that book actually took 10 years to write. It was a major project for me as I was exploring the question of what did Tolkien read of modern literature. And the reason I came about to ask that question is that in reading Tolkien, I've been seriously reading and thinking about Tolkien for more than 30 years. He was, favorite author of my childhood. And then when I got into my teens, began to get more interested in his work seriously, wrote about him as a graduate student, and then obviously here I am. But all along, I was thinking of Tolkien primarily as a medievalist. In fact, when I went to graduate school, I did my master's degree. Started out, I was going to be doing medieval literature, pretty much inspired by Tolkien, with his work on Beowulf and all that. And I ended up shifting over to did my dissertation on modern fantasy literature, and centered on Tolkien and his Lord of the Rings, but also on his great essay on fairy stories, which unpacks the way that fantasy works as a form, which I have always found really, really interesting. And in the process of writing my dissertation, which was a historical study of the genre from Victorian to modern, I started realizing, there was fantasy before Tolkien. I wonder what he had read of it. I knew he had read some of it because he makes some references on fairy stories, but I wondered, how much of it had he read? And then, finished my dissertation, got my PhD, went on teaching, and still thinking about this question. So 10 years after that, I started kind of coming back to it again, and also asking myself the question, why is it that The Lord of the Rings is so popular? Because if it's fundamentally medieval, that, as I and many authors had assumed, that doesn't really account for how engaging it is. I mean, I love Beowulf, but people don't bring Beowulf to the beach, right? Most people don't. And I began to realize that there's something really modern about The Lord of the Rings. And to be sure, there are some scholars of Tolkien who had noticed this. but they were kind of voices crying in the wilderness. Kind of a prevailing assumption that he was sort of fundamentally backward looking. And this was really put in, sort of set in stone by his first biographer, and still his only official biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, who was writing about Tolkien, just says straight out that he read really nothing of modern fiction and took no serious notice of it. And I took that as true because it's the official biographer. Surely he would know. But then I started returning to this question of, well, what had he read of modern fantasy? Started looking into it. Oh, he surprising number of references are turning up. I wonder how much he had read of modern literature in general. Surprising number of references turning up. And I kept going and finding more things and digging into all of his interviews, looking through his letters with a fine-tooth comb, all the interviews with him, his friends, his family, his students, his all of his writings. And by the time that I was done, there were more than 200 authors that I turned up of modern authors post 1850 that we can definitively prove that he read. Like there's evidence he owned the book or he references it. Now, there's obviously loads more that they don't know about, but this is a lot. And so then Tolkien's modern reading was an exploration of what influences these books might have had on him, but also sort of more broadly speaking, how does this change our understanding of Tolkien as a creative artist? Because it just shows that Humphrey Carpenter was simply mistaken. It is simply not the case that he didn't take any notice of modern fiction. That is evidentially not true. So we have to sort of reframe it. And again, there are Tolkien scholars who had noticed that he had read modern things, but it had just been this modern thing or that modern thing. Nobody had taken the whole accumulation and put it all together and said, what does this do for our picture of Tolkien? And I found it was very, very illuminating. And it shows him to be much more nuanced as a thinker, as a writer. And it begins to answer that question of how is it that The Lord of the Rings is so effective? Because among all the many reasons, and there are loads of reasons, one of them is Tolkien was really well grounded in the modern world. He had a foot in the medieval world, absolutely. He had a foot in the modern world, and that's how he's able to be so effective in communicating the flavor of the medieval world, because he knows the modern audience to be able to receive it. And so he's able to communicate because he has a foot in both worlds. So I think this helps to kind of get a greater understanding of what he's doing in The Lord of the Rings and in all of his writings.
Yeah, I very much enjoyed Tolkien's modern reading when it came out, and it's such a treasure because Tolkien, really the Inklings in general, I think, weren't kind of part of, for lack of a better term, what we might call the mainstream literary set of the day. You have contemporary figures like Green and Waugh in Catholic writing circles, for example, who their essays pop up in the expected places, right? They pop up in the Catholic Herald, or they pop up in Blackfriars, doing book reviews, things like that, the typical essays and such. Whereas Tolkien and Lewis maybe more so kind of crossed over there, but Tolkien, I think, really had that very interesting, almost double life of the world of academe and then of his artistic creation. And he didn't sort of seem to enter into the fray of doing the other things that other contemporary authors did to sort of be on the scene, so to speak, writing the contemporary book reviews, writing appraisals of what was on stage in the London theater and things like that. So it's quite a valuable resource and insight because I think what you've done in uncovering those sources in Tolkien, it's just much less accessible to the average reader than with some of these other authors, where you can very easily go into archives and find out kind of where their finger was located on the pulse of their contemporary culture.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this kind of brings us over into Tolkien's Faith, my new book, the biography, if we can sort of hop over. because that's, it's a biography, so it's different. Tolkien's Modern Reading is a literary critical work that is tied to his biography in the sense that is what did he read. Tolkien's Modern Reading is, so Tolkien's Faith is a biography, but to do it, what I did was to go really into all the details of the archives, which meant going into the more obscure ones, because looking at little notices in the Catholic Herald and the tablet, not just looking for things that Tolkien wrote, because he didn't do much in that respect, but looking at how they show him participating in that world, and little references to him showing up at events. So he turned up at events in Oxford next to Waugh. He knew Waugh. They both were at the retirement party for Ronald Knox, which was a big do in Oxford. And that was very illuminating, getting into really the absolute fine-grained detail of things like, what was Tolkien's life like as an Oxford Don in the Catholic world of Oxford? Because that's been something really hasn't been explored. People are generally aware that he is Catholic, but it's sort of almost been compartmentalized. Like, oh yeah, he was Catholic, great, that's nice for him. Now let's look at his academic work, let's look at his literary work. But you really can't. He didn't compartmentalize it. He's very clear about that in his own writings and interviews and letters. All of his friends attest to the fact that he did not compartmentalize it. And I was just intrigued to find, when I went into this archival research, really kind of rolling up my sleeves and getting into it, that he was very present as a Catholic. He was involved with student societies, with the Newman Society, the Catholic Society in Oxford. He was involved with the National Newman Association for a number of years. He was a vice president. He was a founding member of the Catenians, which is the Oxford Circle of Catenians, which is a Catholic men's society, and quite new at that time. He's active, and he's turning up at these Catholic events, and I realized that all of this is sort of under the radar. People haven't known what to look for, and so they haven't looked, and so they've assumed that he was simply sort of privately Catholic. But in fact, he was very much a public figure as a Catholic academic in a way that I think we haven't seen before. And that also extends to other parts of his life, but that particularly struck me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think we could all kind of point to some things contextually that speak to his Catholic faith. But how did that research sort of inform your reading of Lord of the Rings, or The Hobbit, after finding all this out about him?
Well, I found that it really enriched it, because if one thing Tolkien says of the Lord of the Rings, he says it's a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. And that bit gets quoted all the time. Not so often is the rest of it quoted, where he says, I can read it properly and make sure I get the quote right. It says, The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. So he's very deliberate about this. It's deliberately Catholic. And that we have to take that into account. Like, we can't just say, he separated from his work. But then he goes on to say, that is why I have not put in, or have cut out, practically all references to anything like religion, to cults and practices in the imaginary world. So it's fundamentally religious. That's why there's no religion in it. Okay, we have to stop there. And he says, for the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. And I think that I understand a lot better what he's getting at now, because he really means fundamentally, quite literally. He was a master of the English language. He worked for the Oxford English Dictionary. Mm-hmm. At the fundament, at the roots, in its essence. Mm-hmm. So it's not his style to make overt references. It's imbued in it. So I began to see, as I worked on Tolkien's faith, the way that it's sort of the wrong approach to go hunting for parallels on the surface. We can see some connections, and they might be legitimate, but that's not where his Catholic element is. And if we stay there, we're going to think he was mistaken, or this doesn't really work. But if you look at the fundamentals, we see things like who God is. He describes the entire work of the Lord of the Rings in one of its themes, at any rate, as a question of who has ultimate power. But trying
Mm.
to seize divine power from God. Okay, that's a pretty religious theme.
Mm.
We have, the theme of mercy and pity, which is very much a Christian theme. And then there's, various, sort of sacramental and Catholic echoes. And this comes out in ways that are quite unexpected. One of the things that comes up a lot in discussions of the Catholic element in Tolkien's fiction is the Marian element, because most Catholics are aware he had a Marian devotion, so they look for that. Okay, Galadriel, she's a Marian figure. Well, yes, this is the case, but a lot more going on there.
Mm.
So, for instance, we look at other characters and I found some really interesting connections to, Arwen is a Marian character, Eowyn
Mm.
is a Marian character, the hobbits are Marian characters, because he's
Mm.
very clear that the hobbits are emblematic of humility, and he links that humility to Mary's Magnificat. So the
Mm.
hobbits are actually Marian characters. This is the kind of implicit fundamental Catholicism in the Lord of the Rings. It's there if you look for it. It's there if you have eyes to see. It doesn't intrude. It doesn't, push itself upon you. Very enriching to see it, um, but you have to kind of find it. It doesn't push itself on you.
Mm. That's really beautiful. And I was going to ask you to give some examples, and you just did. So thank you. But yeah, and I think that probably speaks to why it's still appealing to people who of no faith or of other. I mean, I'm thinking my brother who's essentially a pagan, and he's got tattoos of Gollum on it. Like he loves Lord of the Rings so much, but it doesn't appear to him as a Catholic work. Yeah, can you speak to that at all? Like how it speaks to sort of both sides and all sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that Tolkien's doing deliberately, and he's a man of great faith. This is something that came through so clearly in researching him for the biography. He didn't. I mean, he wasn't always totally constant in his practice of the faith. He admits that, but he has a very sincere and deep faith, and he's very clear about this being at the heart of his writing. But his mode of presenting it is deliberately implicit. And I think, biographically speaking, that this has a lot to do with kind of his upbringing. First of all, he's orphaned early on. He's effectively raised by Father Francis Morgan and the other Oratorian fathers, who are all converts, or most of them are converts, from Protestantism to Catholicism, at a time when Catholicism was very much the minority faith in England. I mean, it still is, but very much a despised minority faith. It was, socially, politically, culturally, everything, a sort of a disliked and disempowered minority. So to be a Catholic was pretty tough. And it would have been very easy, as some Catholics did, for Tolkien, especially because his mother, had died with her faith rejected by the family. He could have very easily become bitter against Protestants. He could have retreated into a Catholic bubble and said, "I don't want to have anything to do with those people." But he didn't, and this had something, I think, important to do with the fact that the Oratorian Fathers, most of them being converts, they weren't afraid of the Protestant world. They recognized the good things that they had gained from it, in their journey into the church. And he was even given permission to continue studying at a Protestant school. He went to King Edward's School. That's actually really remarkable for his time and context. He even had scripture classes at that school. And that means that his guardian was confident that he wouldn't, that he would be able to understand, okay, these are my Protestant classmates and my nonconformist classmates too, even some Jewish classmates. It's quite interesting. It was a remarkable school, King Edward's. So I think quite early on, he gets a sort of lived ecumenism. And he ends up living this throughout his whole life. And we see this most vividly in the Inklings, because the Inklings are very much mixed. There's quite a few Catholics there, because C.S. Lewis was very welcoming of Catholics, but, about half Anglicans and, a couple Presbyterians. And he's very much a member of that. So all through his life, he has strong Catholic convictions, but he also, very much in anticipation, I think, of the Second Vatican Council, he's aware that these are his separated brethren, the emphasis on the brethren. He's able to get on with them, to be friends with them. He has friends who are Jewish. He speaks very favorably of Cecil Roth, for instance. And amongst his students, he had various students and later, friends and colleagues who were not Christian at all, atheist or agnostic. So there's kind of a big-hearted quality to his faith. And I think that is part of what's embodied in The Lord of the Rings and all of his writings, which I think we can sort of sense, because he wasn't the least bit defensive. He knew what he believed to be true. And it's the undergirding, the underpinning of the moral structure, the moral economy of his whole work. But he didn't feel the need to hammer people over the head with it. And I think that confidence in his faith and that sort of welcoming nature, without compromising what he believed, I think you can't help but respond to it, because there's a kind of humanity or a warmth there that I think one can respect, even if one doesn't agree with it. And he certainly makes it possible for people to come in and to engage with, sort of the human element. Because that was, the last thing I'll comment on this is he once remarked that he felt that he had been blessed with a sense of the human. He said that to his friend Clyde Kilby. And I think that recognition of our common humanity as being made in the image of God for everybody, regardless of their profession of faith or not, again, I think that also comes through in the work and makes it so accessible for everybody.
Yeah, there's this fascinating parallel that keeps occurring to my mind in a way, and somebody could probably have fun with this as a project of writing, to compare and contrast kind of, we mentioned Waugh, being his contemporary. And I almost think that in that generation following Chesterton and Belloc, right, there are kind of embodiments of each of their temperaments in their approach to Catholicism. And Waugh very much strikes me as more a Ballocian figure, indebted though he is certainly to Chesterton, and Tolkien very much more as a Chestertonian figure, in that he, even the sources he looks to, finding in paganism, Chesterton had this continuing, even after conversion, delight in these notions of the household gods and, the fairy, the tradition of fairy in England, and how it was sort of a unique form of the seeds of the gospel, as it were, that not the old Roman sense, but there's something magical in the Celtic and Norse embodiment of that. And you see that coming up with Tolkien. And I think that kind of provokes my next question, because this is the, podcast of the Society of G.K. Chesterton. So, in either of these works, whether it be Tolkien's Faith or indeed in Tolkien's Modern Reading, because Chesterton would be a modern whom we know that he did read at least somewhat. What connections can you draw out for our listeners and viewers on that score between Chesterton and Tolkien?
Well, I think there's quite a lot, because we know that he did read not just some Chesterton, but quite a lot of Chesterton. In Tolkien's Modern Reading, he read quite early on as a schoolboy Chesterton's Orthodoxy and Heretics. He gave them to a King Edward school. We know that he read at least some of the Father Brown stories. Didn't care for them, and which is interesting. We might come back to that later. He loved his comic poetry, so he read Lepanto. He knew Lepanto by heart. He used to go around reciting it, apparently, and he knew many of the comic songs, like the ones from
The Flying Inn.
Flying In, yes. I couldn't. I was thinking of the adjective, the flying in. The song of, to go around reciting the song of Poodle. And he also said he'd read Chesterton's Everlasting Man. He said that he particularly valued Chesterton's apologetics books, and said that he found the argument of the Everlasting Man absolutely valid. And I think that this is part of that, that overall influence. I mean, he's coming to it from other angles as well, but I think Chesterton undoubtedly helped in developing that warmth and respect, or at least encouraged what he already had, because Tolkien always valued, like Chesterton, the ancient myths, saw much that was good in them, was able to say, okay, they aren't all the way at Christianity, but they're part of the way. Here is what we can see that is good and beautiful. That's a great capacity in Tolkien, and it would have been at the least affirmed by what he had read of Chesterton.
That's wonderful. I had heard that Tolkien read the Ballad of the White Horse like in the trenches. Is that true, or is that just a legend?
He had read the Ballad of the White Horse. That he read it in the trenches is a legend.
Oh.
And this might be a bit of a conflation, because of another account. Chesterton's poem Lepanto was read in the trenches by a number of British soldiers in the First World War. No evidence that Tolkien was one of them, but it was a popular poem for the soldiers in the trenches. Those two legends might have sort of intersected. But he did read the Ballad of the White Horse. He calls it a brilliant smash and glitter of language, he says. But being Tolkien, he's quite annoyed at the historical inaccuracy of it, because I mean, he can't help but, this is Tolkien, he can't help but notice, but he didn't get the history right. This is the Angles, you haven't got it right. And of course, Chesterton's like, yeah, who cares? That's a
Right.
good story.
History never got in the way of a good story for Chesterton, but I could completely see that for Tolkien. That's great.
Exactly. So he had, and again, this admiration wasn't uncritical. He didn't simply, adulate everything that Chesterton ever did because he was a fellow Catholic, a fellow Christian. But he liked a lot of what he read and thought very highly of, certain pieces, especially, And I do think it's interesting that he especially liked the apologetics works, because that isn't necessarily what we might expect. We might expect C.S. Lewis to like those especially, but for Tolkien to single those out, I think, again, we have to make sure we don't push Tolkien into sort of, pigeonholes of like what we would expect.
Right. And if you wouldn't mind, can we visit that Father Brown reference?
Right. Well, he didn't care for them, and that is all that we know of his reaction. But I found myself, when I was writing Tolkien's Modern Reading, trying to figure out, well, why might he not have liked them? And I was able to put this in context because Tolkien enjoyed mystery stories. He read Dorothy Sayers' mystery stories, and he had Agatha Christie was a particular favorite. He loved Agatha Christie. And of Sayers, he really likes the first few, the first ones that just have Lord Peter Wimsey. He read all of them. And he didn't like the later ones where Harriet Vane comes in and they become more novelistic and more psychological. And there's also a mystery by Michael Innes that I was actually able to figure out which one it was that he read based on Tolkien's observation about a plot point. I was a bit of a detective myself in doing this work. And he finds it interesting only in one little technical point. Well, the rest of that is more psychological. So I think, based on the larger context of what he liked, what he didn't like, and what he said he liked about them, I think he was just a great fan of the puzzle kind of mystery, the classic Agatha Christie, here are the clues, let's put them together, and it's revealed at the end, like the puzzle kind. And he didn't care for the more psychological story in which the mystery is just kind of an excuse to have the narrative. Well, Father Brown, those are really more psychological of interest rather than they're not really puzzle mysteries.
Not at all, no.
And so I think this is no slight on Chesterton or Father Brown. It's just that wasn't the kind of mystery that Tolkien particularly enjoyed, and so we did enjoy those. And
Do
again,
you think it had anything to do with the overtness of the Catholicism in Father Brown, which is funny because they were written mostly before Chesterton was Catholic, but do you think that might have had something to do with it, or do you think it was purely that sort of aesthetic element?
I think it was probably that aesthetic element, because
Yeah.
he enjoys other books in which the Catholicism is overt, and including others of Chesterton's. So I think he just didn't care for that kind of story.
I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, back on the on him liking the apologetics of Chesterton, I can't help but think, you know, I was just having a conversation over the weekend, and someone said, "Can you sum up all of Chesterton's philosophy in kind of one sentence? Easier, or one paragraph, easier said than done." But I did point to, I said, I think the ethics of Elfland in Orthodoxy is sort of the kernel, or the seed kernel, of Chesterton's whole philosophy, and if you will, the kind of flowering of that plant probably is the God in the cave in The Everlasting Man. And if you kind of take those two signal points, you really do kind of get all of Chesterton. And it strikes me that the themes and symbols there, the way, particularly the way in which Chesterton approaches the mysteries of faith, in that it has this similarity to Tolkien in that I almost want to call it fractal. Like Chesterton famously says one place, this is appropriate because as this podcast is airing, it's the season of Advent. He says in one place, anyone speaking about the child born in winter, the holy child born in winter, would mean the same thing as we mean by it, that there's, a home for the homeless. And he kind of waxes poetical about this, but this idea that there's something of beauty and power in the incarnational symbol itself, the symbolism itself, that I think sometimes we miss, even as practicing Catholics, right? We understand almost, if you take the sacraments, we understand the content of the sacraments really well. What is behind the mystery, but sometimes the sign symbol, the visceral nature of it, the chewing of the bread and the drinking of the wine, kind of get lost to us, or why those are the means by which these sacred things are conveyed. That seems to be a very, very common sensibility between Chesterton and Tolkien, that kind of universal appeal on the level of just human emotion and human universal sympathies. What are your thoughts on that? I know I said a lot there, but
Well, I'm nodding along. I don't know if the camera was picking up how I was nodding as you were saying that, but I was. But yeah, I think that is really a shared element, and it's interesting to look at the way that Tolkien helped C.S. Lewis to come into Christian faith, and that's something I looked at a good deal in the biography in Tolkien's Faith, because most people know, okay, they had that famous Addison's Walk conversation. Tolkien helped Lewis along, and then Lewis, becomes a famous apologist. But it's interesting to look really at the context of that conversation and ask, well, what did he say? What was it that helped Lewis along? And we don't have any transcript. We don't have any letters that directly say what Tolkien said. We have Lewis talking about, quite shortly after, writing to his friend Arthur Greaves, explaining that they had helped him understand what Christianity meant. That he had previously a hard time with doctrines like, what is the word, satisfaction or atonement. He understood it abstractly, but he didn't find it meaningful. It was this weird abstract thing. And he could appreciate it as a story in, in say Greek myth or Norse myth, but in the Christian Gospels, he was very put off by it. And Lewis recounts that Tolkien, and also to a lesser extent, I think Hugo Dyson was also in that walk with them, that they helped him see that Christianity is fundamentally a story. These are things that happened. It's a story that actually happened, but he can respond to it as a story. So we have that from Lewis's letters, but it's also interesting to look at Tolkien wrote a poem called Mythopoeia, that if you look at the dating, is quite close to this, and it's actually a response to that conversation. He writes it from Philomythos to Misomythos, from lover of myths to hater of myths, Tolkien to Lewis, and it's shortly after the Addison's Walk conversation, and so I think we can take it as sort of Tolkien's return to that conversation and a renewal of the themes in it as he's trying to, help his friend get some traction on these new ideas. And this poem is really underappreciated, and I think it's because there's a paragraph or a stanza of it quoted in On Fairy Stories, but the poem is much longer than that. But it's not in print in any American edition. You can only get it in the UK edition of Tree and Leaf. So it's in print, but it's in the UK. Marvelous poem, marvelous poem. And if we look at that poem in depth, we see very much that kind of Chestertonian approach that you were just talking about. He's talking about how the universe itself is kind of soaked with meaning, that you can't just look at a star and say a star. You have to see it as, as a jeweled, a part of the jeweled tent of the heavens. And he's really directly challenging a kind of materialism that just thinks it has everything figured out if you can label it. And he's saying, no, 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 no. You have to really enter into the sort of the mystery of it, the beauty of it, and then you can start to see what it means. Again, very sort of Chestertonian, even in his language, that he's using. And this, I think, helps Lewis to get it. And then, of course, Lewis goes on to share that thought more fully with a much wider audience with his essay, "The Myth Made Fact," and things like that. But it's Tolkien who's first to say, no, we need to have this fundamental recognition that Christianity is a story. He calls it on Fairy Stories, legend and history have met and fused. And then Lewis goes on to say that it's the myth that was made fact.
Beautiful. It reminds me too of Tolkien's idea of Subc Creation, and how, as an artist, you're kind of entering into the creation that God does in a smaller, lesser way. Yeah. Do you have anything on Subc Creation in your book?
Well, I think a little bit, because that starts then to move into the more literary, critical, and theological. And I had to stop myself somewhere, because otherwise the book would be even longer than it is.
Yeah.
But that idea of subcreation really, and I do write about this in Tolkien's Faith. It's really connected directly to his theological understanding, because he says very directly on Fairy Stories, we make because we are made, and we are made in the image and likeness of a maker. So it's because of the divine creativity that human beings are then able to secondarily create. So I think that understanding, and he said himself that he said creativity is a gift from God. That understanding of the creative act is fundamentally rooted in his understanding of God as the ultimate creator. That we're all participating in that, in our small ways as creators, and that he touches on that in his poem Mythopoeia as well.
I would be remiss not to ask. Both Grettelyn and I have musical backgrounds, and one striking point of difference, I would say, between Tolkien and Chesterton seems to me to be that Chesterton had really no appreciation or ear for music. He didn't quite understand music at all, whereas to me, for Tolkien, it seems so central an image. It's all over the place. The more I reread, and I have it's an annual project of mine. I reread the Tolkien, the main corpus, Silmarillion through Lord of the Rings. Sometimes the appendices, not always, but the music is all over the place in Tolkien, and I wonder just what insights you have about his appreciation for music and his where that enters into perhaps his faith. I mean, that I could imagine that it could be an important part of it. I know that he attended mass frequently at Blackfriars Oxford, and I don't know if they had particularly good schola or anything. Any insights you have about it would just be welcome.
Yeah, interestingly, it's odd you say that because Blackfriars is one of the places that we don't have evidence that he attended particularly frequently.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
He turns up all the time. I don't know why people have that idea. He went to St. Aloysius quite often. He
Hmm.
did go sometimes to Blackfriars. We have a few points, but there's no indication that that was his regular place of going. Um, and that actually probably wouldn't have had music because it's the house of this the Dominican study house, and in his time obviously it could be different, but certainly now mass there is just said, it's because it's the brothers and the fathers coming in to say mass. There's not really there's no it's not a parish. I think that's key. There's no choir. St. Aloysius, on the other hand, has a great tradition of really great music. Whether, and I imagine that was probably still the case, or was already the case then. But we've jumped ahead a little bit. Looking back at his formation, it's interesting to think about as a boy getting his early formation as a Catholic. It's at the Birmingham Oratory, and they had a really great musical formation. They had a big organ. They did a lot of sung masses to very high standard choir, and it was there that he was introduced to plain chant. And his daughter Priscilla noted that Gregorian plain chant was the only music that she knew her father to truly love. So he appreciated other kinds of music, but he truly loved chant. And it's interesting to note that this is very much a characteristic of the oratory. It wouldn't have been characteristic of other Catholic churches at the time. Hymn singing in ordinary Catholic churches was really not common at all. In fact, Newman and his oratory were part of the push to bring it back, or to bring it into English Catholic churches. And this is a legacy of the Reformation in England, because when you're being persecuted for being Catholic, you don't sing while you're having mass. You keep your voices down. um, and if you're in some crummy, after it's made legal again, you're in some shabby little tiny chapel. You don't have money to have a good organ. You just, yeah. So there isn't a really a strong tradition of hymn singing or music in English Catholic culture at the time that Tolkien's growing up, except in the oratory, which is exceptional. And there he does get a very high standard of sort of musical formation in the context of the liturgy. And this is such a formational period in his life that I think it must have made a huge mark on him. And I think that's where we see that later love. And we even know, I mean, he said, for instance, that Galadriel's lament, as the fellowship leaves, is actually based on the tones of the chant for Tenebrae, the service of Tenebrae, which is from the Book of Lamentations. So we have a direct liturgical music connection between with the Lord of the Rings, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting because, a bit of a chant scholar, but chant has been argued to be the most representative of the language of all musical forms. And as we know, Tolkien loved language so much that I'm sure that wouldn't have gone unnoticed by him. So.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because I am not a musician, nor do I pretend that I am, but that's a really interesting sort of development. Like, that helps to explain why it meant a lot to him. That's really
Yeah, because as a musical, chant isn't exactly pop music. So, and even for someone very intellectual like Tolkien, I could definitely see how that would affect him, because it's about language. It really is. So beautiful. Well, we are coming up on time here. Man, I wish we could just, I always say this, but it's always true. Like, I love talking to our guests. I wish we had so much more time. Is there anything else you'd want to share with our listeners and viewers before we have to sign off here, Holly?
Um, well, I think I would just share the biggest insight that I've gotten from now doing two books that explore Tolkien. First Tolkien's Modern Reading, that showed how much more well-rounded he was, just as a interested in the world, interested in modern literature, and then doing Tolkien's Faith and seeing how much more well-rounded he was as a Catholic. That it was much more integral to his life than even I thought. I knew it was important to him. I didn't realize it was this important. And I was struck by, in doing Tolkien's Faith, by the way that he was far from perfect. He had faults. He admitted it. He had, for instance, quite a ferocious temper. He could lose his temper at times. He went through stretches that were barren in his faith. He had quite a long stretch when he said to his son later, "I almost ceased to practice my religion." So he knew what it was like to have the downward ebbs as well as the high points. And of course, he went through so much in his life. And I think that helped humanize him. I mean, I had always admired Tolkien. I mean, my whole life I've been reading Tolkien. And I wrote another book about him. I always admired him. But I think it was when I finished writing Tolkien's Faith, I realized that I loved him as a person, as someone who I felt I had got to know, that wasn't anymore this sort of plaster saint on a shelf or this idealized author. He was a human being who fell and made mistakes and got up again and carried on. And I think the results of the sort of combined work on this has made me really feel he's such a more of a role model in a way, because you can look at him and say, here is a real person who did these things and had this life. He wasn't perfect, but by golly, he kept trying. And so I just found that human aspect of his character, well, kind of Chestertonian in that sense. I think with Chesterton, we have that same sense of a real personality, a real person that we kind of want to sit down and hang out with. And that's what I found with Tolkien after doing this work.
And what a beautiful encapsulation too of what it means to be Catholic. We're practicing Catholics. We're practicing. We're gonna get there hopefully, but you keep on trying. Beautiful. Well, Joe, do you have any final thoughts? I think we're gonna have to wrap up here.
No, just encourage our listeners and viewers to check out the show notes. We'll have links to the resources we talked about today. You can get a copy of either of Holly's books, and I personally recommend them very strongly. And thank Word on Fire for the great work it's doing in providing for this kind of scholarship. And thank you again, Holly, for the great work that you've done on these two books. And I look forward to whatever's in the future.
Thank you very much.
Well, yeah, and thank you for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure to chat with you.
Oh, my pleasure.
And thank you, Joe. It's always a lot of fun.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening to us. Please, if you enjoyed what you heard today, please feel free to subscribe, hit the like button, get notified every time that we release new content. Also, leave us comments. We want to know what you want to hear about. I don't know if you have anything for Holly, leave a comment, we can pass it on, and engage with us, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. Thank you, and God bless.